Government bills. Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. I recognize the Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 12th report on the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, entitled Financialization of Housing. Pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to this report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci.
Thank you. Once again, presenting reports from committees.
Mr. Dubourg.
Mr. Dubourg. Oh, sorry. The Honourable Member for Bourassa.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to present in both official languages the 12th report of the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs entitled National Strategy for Veterans Employment. Conformément
Pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a fulsome response to the report. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank all of the members of the team and the staff who work with us at committee, and especially congratulate the analysts, because through this study we heard from 36 witnesses. We had a ton of briefs. Our analysts did excellent work. We're very, very lucky to have such excellent and devoted staff here in the House of Commons of Canada. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Bourassa. If I could ask once again all members of this House, and particularly the member for Windsor West and the member for Eglinton North, to possibly take your discussion to a more private place so that I can better hear the members who are speaking. Introduction of private members' bills. Ms. Zerillo, seconded by Mr. Massey, asks leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Establish a National Strategy to Reduce the Amount of Wasted Food in Canada. This motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill, the Wasted Food Reduction and Recovery Act, was inspired by Becky Greenlees, Ann Nelson, the Tri-Cities Mums Group, and Immigrant Link Society, all who continue to rescue food and feed families in Port Moody Coquitlam. Food is wasted at alarming rates in Canada. Over 50 million tons of food are wasted every year. And it doesn't have to be this way. Community groups like Second Harvest have the solutions, and the government needs to act. As food prices continue to climb and more Canadians are facing food insecurity, we must reduce the amount of good, healthy food that is wasted. Over 500,000 children are relying on food banks every month while landfills fill up with perfectly good food. Wasted food is harmful to people and to the environment. The government has allowed this problem to go unchecked and allowed private companies to use marketing tactics like arbitrary best before dates to increase their profits while leaving Canadians hungry. I ask the government to adopt this bill as its own and help stop wasted food.
Ms. Zerillo, seconded by Mr. Massey, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted. When shall the bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Mr. Genius, seconded by Mr. McLean, moves that the third report of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, presented on Monday, May 2nd, 2022, be concurred in. Debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be sharing my time. It's a pleasure for me to speak today on this important third report of the Transport Committee, and it is a report with one recommendation. That recommendation is that the Government of Canada abolish the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I was actually quite pleased to see that this was a recommendation endorsed by the majority of the committee, and I hope that therefore, as a result of today's debate, this will be concurred in, and we will therefore have a decision by the House to call for the abolition of Canada's Infrastructure Bank. Now this underlines really the reverse Midas touch that this Prime Minister has. Everyone's heard of the Midas touch from the old myth where there was a king who everything he touched turned into gold. Well, that would have been great for his national economy, although it might have led to inflation given the increase in the supply of gold. And what we have with this Prime Minister, though, is a reverse Midas touch. That is, everything he touches turns into complete disaster. It would be of mythical proportions if it wasn't demonstrable in the clear record of this government and this Prime Minister. After 8 years, this Liberal NDP government truly has the Midas touch, although I can guess that from the fact that the majority of the committee endorsed this report, it may have been that even the NDP agreed to this recommendation to abolish the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Et tu, Brute. It's a majority recommendation from the committee. So let's talk about the record of this infrastructure bank that the Liberals have been championing. It's projected to lose money every single year, Madam Speaker. It hasn't completed a single project, and according to Statistics Canada's definition of private sector investment, it has attracted no private sector investment. That is a pretty clear indictment of the immense failure that we've seen at this so-called infrastructure bank that has not completed any infrastructure projects. Only this Prime Minister could lose money running a bank, Madam Speaker. Reverse Midas touch. Indeed, and we could talk about ethics in government. We could talk about our economic situation. We could talk about our foreign policy reputation. We could talk about the situation of crime, of drugs and disorder. It's clear that this Prime Minister has a whopping, massive record of failures, of not delivering on the things that Canadians want. And this is why more and more Canadians are responding to the call for a common sense plan. After 8 years, people have had enough of the NDP Liberal government's record of failures. They're looking for a common sense conservative alternative, one that will put the interests and the well-being of Canadians first. Yes, their homes, their jobs, their paychecks, their well-being. Now, Madam Speaker, I wanted to address one specific aspect of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and that is the close relationship between this government and McKinsey, and how that relationship was part of the story of the creation of this so-called bank. So it's been clear from the beginning that this government has a close and cozy relationship with the consulting company McKinsey. McKinsey has gotten over $100 million of contracts from the government. While the public service has grown, there's been a significant expansion in outsourcing, and McKinsey has been a big part of that. This government has a close relationship with McKinsey in spite of the role that McKinsey played advising Purdue Pharma on how to fuel the opioid crisis, in spite of the fact that McKinsey advised the Saudi government, giving them information about dissidents, and that information leading to the subsequent targeting of these dissidents. And we've spoken in the House before at great length about the, frankly, innumerable ethical and moral failures of McKinsey. But what happened in this context in particular is that Dominic Barton, who was the former managing partner at McKinsey, was an advisor to the government. He led something called the Growth Council, the Prime Minister's Growth Council, at the same time as McKinsey was pitching its products to the government. So according to his testimony, he wasn't directly involved in the pitching process, but one of the people that was working within McKinsey was involved in supplying analysts for Canada's Growth Council at the same time as that person was involved in pitching to the government for Government of Canada contracts and business. And they were quite successful in getting this business from the government. So this was an instance of a cozy relationship between a consulting firm and the government, and a situation in which that consulting firm was able to do a great deal of business. Dominic Barton was subsequently made ambassador to China, and he was asked by a member of the government at, I believe it was the previous meeting of the Transport Committee, about the question was, as ambassador, did you misuse your position to lobby for business somehow for a company with which you were no longer associated and for which you didn't profit? And Dominic Barton replied, there were extremely strict rules and protocols put in place. Basically, it was excommunicado. There were very strict processes and protocols followed. If anything ever came in, it went to the deputy head of mission or the deputy. That was a very interesting claim. A claim subsequently contradicted, though, by emails that were made public that revealed, in fact, something quite different. That there was discussion specifically about and I'm trying to find the emails in front of me, but I'll get to them if people want the specific citations during questions and comments. But subsequently, there was an email exchange, and we probed this issue at another meeting of the Transport Committee, because what happened is that the email exchange was specifically looking at the availability of Mr. Barton while he was the ambassador to China to participate in a call related to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. And it was evident from those emails that there was conversation. There were conversations about the Infrastructure Bank that, in fact, Dominic Barton was involved in, and so conservatives sought to hold these Dominic Barton accountable for this at committee and ask, how is it that you were no longer with McKinsey ostensibly, but you had these close relationships with all these folks who worked for McKinsey, many people who had worked for McKinsey ending up in influential roles within the Infrastructure Bank, and that you, as ambassador to China, working for the government, were still involved in these kinds of calls. In fact, at one point, it was referenced in one of those emails that, well, this was a very sensitive matter. And Madam Speaker, no surprise it was a sensitive matter. It's a very sensitive matter because people didn't want it to come out that there was this very close relationship between the government and McKinsey. And I believe that the closeness of that relationship played a significant role in the creation of this infrastructure bank, an infrastructure bank that subsequently engaged many people who were or had previously worked for McKinsey. So it was very, very beneficial for McKinsey. McKinsey did well out of this, but it was not beneficial for Canadians to have a so-called infrastructure bank in the end that is losing money every year, hasn't completed a single project, and has attracted no private sector investment. The so-called infrastructure bank is delivering for Liberal insiders. It delivered for McKinsey, but it's not delivering for Canadians. And we can talk about the many failures of this government to deliver results for Canadians, but I think what's underlining that failure to deliver results for Canadians is that they are working hard to deliver for someone else. That is, that are working hard to deliver for well-connected insiders. And while I'm on my feet, I should mention that today at the Government Operations Committee, we have hearings on another important ongoing Liberal scandal. This is the Arrive scam issue. $54 million were spent on an app that was really glitchy, that didn't work properly, and you had well-connected middlemen who did no IT work, who were collecting a significant amount of money, over $11 million, simply to receive and then subcontract that work out. Again, I can tell you Conservatives are going to be fighting to get to the bottom of what happened with the Arrive scam. We've seen in the news today new information that there were more contracts, another $9 million contract that was given to GC Strategies. These well-connected Liberal insiders have been cashing in, it seems now, on multiple contracts. Again, the Liberals and the Liberal NDP government in general are trying to assist well-connected insiders, but they're failing to deliver for Canadians. We need a new government, a common-sense alternative that will actually stand up for the best interests of the Canadian people.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, you know, the Conservatives, when it comes to dealing with public policy, they've demonstrated one thing, and that is they're a very high-risk party. You want to talk about being reckless, Madam Speaker? All you need to do is take a look in terms of their attitudes towards what are excellent programs. Think about it. The member says the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and he's critical of it. What will the Conservative Party do? They'll get rid of it completely. Think of the billions of dollars of... You know, and like a bunch of, I was about to say seals, Madam Speaker, but they were all clapping as one, worshipping the fact that they want to get rid of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Do they not realize what it is that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has delivered for Canadians in terms of jobs thus far, the billions of dollars in investment? My question is, can the member be very specific as to why it is the Conservative Party, in a reckless way, wants to get rid of the Canada Infrastructure Bank? Explain that.
There are members who seem to want to answer the questions being asked, and it's not the member that should be responding to the question once I give them the floor. So I just want to remind members, if they have thoughts or ideas, they need to keep it to themselves. Questions? The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan for response.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think my colleagues were inspired by references to Midas. They wanted to bring the Greek chorus phenomenon into Parliament here, and I do welcome the affirmative lyrical support from my dear colleagues. The member across the way is trying to characterize our position on the infrastructure bank as if you know, we just woke up this morning and decided to do it. We are proposing to concur in a committee report that was the result of extensive study, and the committee report came out with a majority recommendation for the abolition of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I can only conclude, if it was a majority of the committee, that the NDP, even their coalition partners in the NDP, after hearing the evidence, agreed that a bank which is losing money every year, hasn't completed a single project, and has attracted no private sector investment, that sounds like an institution that's not working very well.
And comments, Honourable Député.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. When we talk about infrastructure, there's a general problem in Canada's federation. It's fiscal imbalances. The federal government can act financially in a more significant way than provinces, but infrastructures, for the most part, are a provincial matter. My colleague could perhaps tell me what he thinks about this. The federal government has the money, but most projects are provincial. This infrastructure bank, the amounts that are affected, should be sent to provinces directly because they know what they need infrastructure-wise. They are directly connected with their province. So I'd like to hear my colleague. Does he agree that infrastructure bank sums should be sent directly to provinces?
For Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As it relates to our position, of course, we are calling for the abolition of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and we do believe very much in the principle of subsidiarity, that the federal government should work collaboratively with provinces and local governments. We also have taken the position that part of that constructive work needs to include setting goals for the development of, for instance, new housing. And the approach we've taken on addressing infrastructure gaps, housing, is to tie infrastructure funding, especially at the local level, to municipalities being able to deliver on critical goals around the construction and availability of new housing. But we also want to give the flexibility of local governments to figure out the best way to do that. We want to work with them to establish goals and achieve results, and to tie those federal investments to those results. I think our approach to this is collaborative, it's effective, and it recognizes the competency of different jurisdictions.
Question, the Honourable Member Courtney Albany.
Speaker, my colleague likes to talk about McKinsey, but under the Conservative government, we saw PricewaterhouseCoopers go from $9.8 million to $45 million in terms of outsourcing. We had Michael Wernick testify at Government Operations Committee, and he cited that there was a direct correlation with the gutting of the public service and now later the cost of outsourcing. And he also highlighted that the cuts when it came to training and leadership had a serious impact on why the government went to outsourcing. Again, New Democrats don't want to see outsourcing. We want to see those jobs remain in the public service. My question through you, Madam Speaker, is, he talked about Dominic Barton. Does he believe Dominic Barton was a closer friend with the current Prime Minister or Prime Minister Harper? Because I think it was with the latter. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
A brief answer from the member for Sherwood Parford, Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to say something very directly to this NDP member. At the Government Operations Committee, we have requested documents related to the government's relationship with McKinsey. We want to insist on having all of those documents. Now, this NDP member wants to look at outsourcing to other companies. I think it's legitimate to look at outsourcing to other companies. But if we don't have the support of the NDP to demand all of the documents on McKinsey, then what's the point in going on to look at other things? We need to be able to access all the documents. So let's get all of the documents from McKinsey, and let's have the support of the NDP to get all of the documents related to McKinsey and insist on those documents, and if they're not provided, to challenge the issue appropriately, and then we can go on to look at other issues. But what's the point in asking for more documents from other companies if we've already set the precedent that we're not actually going to insist that those documents be delivered?
Debate, the Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Nice to see you. Nice to speak on behalf of the residents of Calgary Centre for the first time in this Parliament. I really appreciate the fact that we have a speech here today on the Canada Infrastructure Bank. When I first ran in Calgary Centre in 2019, this was one of the key items on the agenda about one of the boondoggles that this government is actually foisting upon Canadians here. And when I say boondoggle, I mean literally boondoggle. Billions of dollars going into a slush fund that doesn't actually meet a requirement that was necessary in the Canadian economy at that point in time. And I say that, Madam Speaker, because I can assure you I worked in the finance industry, and there were all kinds of infrastructure funds across Canada. The thing about those infrastructure funds is they invest in actual projects that make sense to invest in. That is, there is a return of capital. Now, the thing about infrastructure funds is the return of capital associated with infrastructure is much lower than it is with any other investment. And that's because most infrastructure is long-lived assets. There's a lot of security involved with it, so it's not going away anytime soon, and it usually has a strong revenue profile associated with that infrastructure, whatever it is, whether it be new rail opportunities or new service opportunities that serve Canadians. But every one of those has to meet a mark, and that mark, of course, is mathematical. It's finance. Now, meeting a cost of capital that's very low is not hard to do, and that's why so many infrastructure funds had funds available for investing in infrastructure in Canada. What we didn't have available was boondoggle funds, and this government saw the opportunity to say we need some boondoggle funds in infrastructure in Canada. Every infrastructure fund in Canada said, no, we don't. We don't need any more infrastructure. We're finding difficulty finding enough good investment opportunities in infrastructure in Canada that we don't need another $5 billion competing with us that's going to be slipping money under the table, frankly, to people on projects that don't make economic sense. And there are a lot of projects in Canada that make economic sense for these infrastructure funds. Now, the issue about competition here is very prevalent because you realize that with all these infrastructure funds that had previously been set up, because so many funds in Canada, so many investors in Canada recognized that Canada had fallen behind on its infrastructure investments and needed more infrastructure. And they're stalled under this government for one reason: this government is not understanding about what actual projects need to get developed in Canada. It's a problem. So their response to that, economic malaise that they've created in the economy is just to put an extra billions of dollars into this instrument, into the Canadian economy, that doesn't have to meet a test of actual economic performance. It's a way around it. It's what they call sustainable finance. And you'll know, Madam Speaker, and my colleagues here all know that I spent a number of years, a couple decades, in the finance industry. These things are mathematical at the end of the day. And I notice my colleague from Kingston the Islands is over there winking at me because he always talks about finance, and I get to instruct him a lot. But the other point here, Madam Speaker, is of course that all these things make sense. At the end of the day, you can't have sustainable finance is a way of playing games around where the return actually comes, because the return actually doesn't come at the end of the day with these funds. What it is a transfer of wealth from all these funds, from all these Canadians, into the pockets of insiders. And I can actually quote how many of these insiders are being paid in this boondoggle the Liberals have created. They've got insiders here, and despite the fact that they've hardly invested any money from this Canada Infrastructure Bank, they've collected in the last couple of years, 2020, 2021, almost $7 million in bonuses. Every employee of this boondoggle investment infrastructure bank actually gets bonuses, despite the fact that at one point in time here they had one investment with the provincial infrastructure system in Quebec that was layered behind in structure behind the actual pension fund in Quebec. And if you want to talk about how that's performing for the Canadian people, I can go into that as well. But then in 2021-22, again, $7.7 million in bonuses to these Liberal insiders that they've appointed over there, transferring money again from Canadians to their friends. It's a boondoggle of the highest order. Investing in economic opportunities that don't exist, that aren't there, that are actually just ways of the government saying, we're trying to paper over the fact that we've ruined the economy. So we'll get some money being invested here into a sector where it no longer makes economic sense. I spoke earlier, Madam Speaker, about this whole concept of sustainable finance. There's no such thing as sustainable finance. There's finance. Finance has always been sustainable. The whole thing about math is the numbers have to go around at the end of the day. And I see my colleague from Kingston the Islands shrugging about that, like, oh, who cares about if the numbers go around? Well, they do. It matters, Madam Speaker. It matters a lot because at the end of the day, somebody's paying the price. And in this case, the people paying the price are the taxpayers of Canada. And they're paying it to the Liberal insiders. And congratulations, if you're on the inside of that, you're making a good living. If you're regular Canadians, you've seen what's happened to the economy as a result of this government's actions. You've ruined the economy. You've actually have investment leaving this country in the hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 8 years, a significant egress of capital. Canada Pension Plan Investment Board doesn't even invest in Canada. It invests in foreign entities because it does not see the opportunity to invest in Canada. The Organization of Exporting and Developing Countries doesn't see the opportunity in Canada. It has us as the lowest ranked growth company out of their 40 members over the next few decades, not the next year, not the next 2 years. For the foreseeable future, Canada is practically uninvestable because of this government's policies. Now, I know it's laughing matter for my colleagues across the way. It's not a laughing matter. Our entire economy depends on this. $1.3 trillion in debt, doubling the national debt. This is not conducive to an actual economy that works, and we've got to get back to making that economy work. What did the government do this year? They doubled down on that, like just not the Canada Infrastructure Bank, but that's not working, so they put $15 billion into a new one, the Canada Growth Fund. Again, without much of a mandate, not passed, it's just, okay, here's some money. We need to have another slush fund that we need to invest in projects that make no economic sense, but make political sense for how to shovel the money out the door a little more, collect some friends, put some money in everybody's pockets. It's all a circular economy, as they say, and it's a sustainable finance model. Well, I suggest it's a sustainable finance model for those stuffing money in their jeans. For the rest of Canadians, it's not sustainable at all. It's a boondoggle. It's a way to make your friends rich at the expense of taxpayers. And we're here for Canadians at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, Canadians that pay their taxes, that expect government to operate efficiently and effectively. Nothing of that order is happening here right now. The opaque nature of every one of these funds and the investments they make is just obscene. There is no way we can continue on this course with continuing billions and billions and billions of dollars going into projects that the Liberals favor, that have no foreseeable outcome at the end of the day. It is really just a way of spinning out and making Canadians more and more poor. Now, I look at this because I know in the report, and we're talking about the report here, the concurrence report, Madam Speaker, and I will refer to it because you actually had Yves Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer, a man I greatly respect and actually have spent a lot of time discussing finance with, but he actually says that despite the CIB's goal of leveraging private investment, projects to date have been exclusively funded by federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government. So there is no leveraging going on, as was the concept and the whole goal of this, and that's because nobody believes this infrastructure bank is actually going to do anything good at the end of the day. It's actually just going to put money, again, into the pockets of insiders. And that's a shame. It's a shame, Madam Speaker, because there's so much more we could be doing with taxpayers' funds. We could be putting money into the needs of Canadians here, and we're not doing that right now. We're running massive deficits. This is part of that massive deficit. When people ask me back home, what would you cut if you're Canadian, if you were government? One of the first things I talk about is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, because it is a boondoggle. Get rid of the boondoggles first and foremost before you actually have to start making real cuts. And this government eventually will have to make real cuts. We'll be ahead of them. We'll be cutting the boondoggles out first and foremost and getting us back to balance in this Canadian economy. Madam Speaker, thank you for the time today. Much appreciated.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I hear the members opposite say, oh, here we go. I think that's because they realize some facts are about to be dropped on their imaginary next 3 hours. Madam Speaker, the member opposite spoke about boondoggle, yet the Conservatives' infrastructure plan consisted of fake lakes, fake photo ops, and he is referring to the Canada Infrastructure Bank as not getting anything done. So I'd like to ask him about a project specifically in his home province of Alberta, which is going to create 143,000 new irrigated acres.
Un appel au règlement, l'honorable député de...
Point of order. I don't know if there are people talking around the member, but it's difficult for the interpreters to hear what is being said.
I just remind members that, if you're having side conversations or trying to participate and it's not your turn to participate, it does create problems for the interpreters to be able to interpret what the actual speaker being recognized is saying. Yeah. So I would just... Est-ce que vous avez compris une partie ou c'est toute la...
Should we start from the top, or it's just a part of what was said?
So the honourable member can wrap it up. She has 18 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There's a project in Alberta that will create over 143,000 new acres of irrigated infrastructure to reduce floods. Does the member opposite believe that residents in Alberta and farmers should have their fields flooded, that they don't deserve infrastructure because the Conservatives would prefer to cancel it?
Yeah. That's what it sounds like.
Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question. It does show she does have some...
Again, I just want to remind members, if they're not being recognized, they shouldn't be speaking. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for the important question. And it's good to hear that she actually does pay attention to some of the development that's happening outside of her home province, including in my province of Alberta. Yes, irrigation that first came up in the 1930s was a way to open up the Dust Bowl, Palliser's Triangle, if you will, make sure we had some irrigable land. And the water that flows through the Rocky Mountain systems and all the way down actually gets stored. And it was an inventive way of actually storing some of that water at that point in time. And there's always been that opportunity to make sure that there's economic progress. What has made that more viable, and if it was totally viable, there would be infrastructure funds competing for it. But what makes that more viable, frankly, is the fact that agriculture is worth more now, because this government has actually punished farmers to the level where prices have gone up. Take a look at how that has affected Canadians at the food store. Canadians are paying far more for food because of this government's policies. Of course, we're going to need more food. We're going to need more of everything going forward here, and it's going to cost about 10% more per year thanks to this government's inflationary policies. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In my riding in Longueuil, We need to fix the sewers. $600 million just for Longueuil. We also have huge projects for the electrification of our transit system, millions upon millions of dollars. There's also a housing crisis. We have projects for housing, as is the case elsewhere. In the infrastructure bank, there's a lot of money. If we were to abolish the infrastructure bank, does my colleague agree that sums have to be transferred to Quebec because cities are municipal, then it's provincial, and provincial matters are often infrastructure matters. And they know their people best. So should we transfer the money straight to Quebec?
Calgary Centre.
Merci beaucoup, Madame le Président.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the question from my colleague. I also read the Bloc Québécois report, a dissident report, and he indicated that they called the infrastructure bank a boondoggle. Money was invested by the government in projects that were in their interest. It's an economic instrument for the federal government, but it's not useful for economic balance in Canada.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And my question will be very brief. You know, polls show, the member today in his intervention spoke about the CPP, and polls show that Albertans are overwhelmingly opposed to the plan by Danielle Smith to introduce the APP, the Alberta Pension Plan. Now, we know that the leader of the official opposition has said that he does not support the Alberta Pension Plan. I think that Albertans deserve to know how their members of parliament stand on this. I do not support the Alberta Pension Plan. Could the member tell us, does he support or not support the Alberta Pension Plan?
The honourable member for Calgary Centre, a brief answer.
I appreciate the question from my colleague from Edmonton. Let me say very clearly that what I support is an independent pension plan, an independent pension plan for all of Canadians, not the one the NDP keeps bringing to the floor of the House of Commons here, where they want to manipulate at the political level what those pension plans invest in, which are going to harm, frankly, all Canadians in their retirement years. And that's what's going to destroy the pensionability of Canadians, as opposed to, what Albertans decide by themselves in a referendum about where they want their pension funds managed. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I have a bit of an issue in the sense there's so much I'd like to be able to provide comment on, and it's in a very limited amount of time. Even the member who just spoke, and to pick up on 2 points, the most recent was the pension question that was asked of the member. It took a while. Unlike the Prime Minister, who came out very clear in regards to the CPP and how important it is to Canada, it took a while for the Conservatives to realize that as a national party and looking at the benefits of all Canadians through the CPP, the leader of the Conservative Party just recently comes out and says, yes, we support it. We're going to get behind it. This member now stands up and he puts a black cloud over that.
That's right.
I don't know where the member stands on the issue. And this is an Alberta MP who just finished talking about, well, we don't want the infrastructure bank. Yet, my colleague just brought up an issue which shows that there are jobs that are created in an area of irrigation. And I just had a late night show debate last night where one of his colleagues from the prairies was saying how important irrigation was. They are so reckless, Madam Speaker.
Yep.
You want to talk about taking a risk? Look at the Conservative Party today. They are all over the place on major policy issue. Now, today, I would like to give, if I could give the Omer Simpson Award. I used to have an Omer Simpson Award when I was inside the Manitoba Legislature because you often hear about some pretty stupid things. I called it the Omer Simpson Award, Madam Speaker. I'm kind of inclined to give that award to someone very special.
The honourable member, Sarnia Lambton.
Speaker, the Speaker issued guidelines in the House, and we're not to use mock names or be insulting in any way to other members of the House, and I hope you would remind the member opposite of that.
So I didn't see that was. I would just say that if it's causing disorder in the House, then I would ask members to please be very careful on the language that they're using. The honourable member was also talking in general, so I would just, not specifically at a individual, but I also want to say, you can't say indirectly what you can't say directly. So just please be careful. We do want to keep the debate going, and we want to make sure that it is respectful. The honourable member for the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
And the point of order does not take time away from me, I assume, Madam Speaker. At the end of the day, take a look in terms of what it is the Conservative Party is saying about the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Read what it is that we've now had 2 members. They want to abolish it, Madam Speaker. They're making it clear. They're reinforcing that fact. They believe that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a bad idea. Yes, it is. As a number of them say, yes, it is. Well, Madam Speaker, that's what I mean about the issue of just being so reckless when it comes to what the interests of Canadians really are. Do they have any idea that we're talking about 46 projects all over Canada? The government is committed just under $10 billion. That's with a capital B, Madam Speaker. Imagine, just under $10 billion. They're going to throw it away. They say it's garbage, that it's not necessary. Right. Do you know that $9.7 billion has now accessed close to 20 additional private sector type of billions of dollars, Madam Speaker? That is an incredible amount of money. They say that there's no projects, or they'll qualify, no projects that have been completed. When you spend billions of dollars on projects, yes, it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. But there are 46 projects that are well underway, including projects that are in the ridings or the provinces, the home provinces of the 2 people that rose to speak on this on the concurrence report, Madam Speaker. Projects that are going to make a huge difference. And they want to get rid of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. You see, it goes back to Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper never really believed in investing in Canada's infrastructure, nowhere near to the same degree that this government has, Madam Speaker. From day one, this government has been focused on Canada's middle class, those aspiring to be a part of it, and supporting those individuals that are in need, Madam Speaker. From day one. And a part of recognizing how we're going to do that is by investing in our economy through the creation of jobs, through the development of trade agreements, through bringing forward a higher standard of infrastructure spending. No government in the history of Canada has spent more money on infrastructure because we recognize to have a strong Canada, you need to invest in infrastructure, Madam Speaker. And with the billions of dollars that we spent and invested in infrastructure, we also had an add-on with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. That infrastructure bank that the Conservatives across the way like to mock, Madam Speaker. And now they want to say we want to abolish it completely. Even in my home province of Manitoba, there's infrastructure dollars from the bank that's going towards the internet, modernizing, making sure that rural Manitoba is connected. On the one hand, the Conservatives are critical, saying that we're not doing enough on rural connectivity, even though we're doing more than Harper did. And then when it comes time for the infrastructure to invest in it, they're saying, no, we don't want that infrastructure. We're going to cancel that infrastructure bank, Madam Speaker. That's what I mean in terms of they have no idea what it is they're talking about. It's almost as if they walk into their back room, they talk to the leader who gets a bright idea, and they make the decision, well, infrastructure bad. Common sense, it's bad. Why is it bad, Madam Speaker? Explain that one to me. When you invest and you see $27 billion going towards Canada's infrastructure on projects that are going to have a profoundly positive impact Yet common sense, according to the conservative ideology, says it's bad. That's why I'm talking about the Homer Simpson Award, Madam Speaker. It's incredible. I do not understand it. And Madam Speaker, when I first found out that we were going to be talking about another concurrence report, the first thing that came across my mind wasn't necessarily to talk about the subject matter, rather to talk about, here we go again, Madam Speaker, with the Conservative Party trying to filibuster legislation. Legislation, Madam Speaker, that is so critically important. Yet they use concurrence motions in order to prevent that legislative debate. Always they do that, Madam Speaker. Let me give you an example. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we were talking about trade agreements. And there's a lot of infrastructure necessary in Ukraine, Madam Speaker. It's a very important deal. Infrastructure that Canada has a great deal of experience on is all part of that trade agreement. So let's talk about 2 days of solid hours and hours and hours of debate that takes place. Something in which we all support. Well, maybe not. I shouldn't say that. Yeah. The member from Cumberland Colchester? Yeah. Remember what he said? Yeah. Canada is taking advantage of Ukraine at a time of war, and why do we even have that particular piece of legislation? He even described it as being woke legislation. When the president of Ukraine comes to Canada to sign an agreement that has so much power in terms of economic ties and messaging in regards to the war, and a huge part of it is dealing with infrastructure, Madam Speaker, you get the Conservative Party, I don't know why, but once again, trying to be mischievous. On the one hand, they say they support Ukraine, barely, and then they do something like this. I said, can we pass it by Christmas? And they waffle. Now we're on another piece of legislation, and they're doing their tactic again, Madam Speaker. Yep. When I came here, I was not expecting to be talking about the infrastructure bank, even though I have a lot more to say on it, Madam Speaker. I was actually expecting to be able to talk on legislation dealing with Investment Canada Act. I think it's Bill C-34, Madam Speaker. That's an act that's sure. You have to recognize that infrastructure in many of our communities, getting things to market. Well, what were we supposed to be talking about today? Foreign investment coming into Canada. A modernization of the Act from 2009, because a lot has changed, Madam Speaker, since then. That's what it is we were supposed to be talking about. You know, ensuring that the minister has, a national security review of transactions that are taking place. AI today is something that's very serious. And when you take that into consideration with international investment, I always thought the Conservatives would be concerned about that, Madam Speaker. I really did. But once again today, we see through the moving of this particular concurrence motion, the Conservative Party is saying, no, they're not being sensitive to issues such as technological advancements and AI and the impact it's having on international investments into Canada. Canada welcomes international investment, Madam Speaker, but we have to make sure that we have things in place and modernize the Act so that whether it's the minister or other processes to protect the technology, to protect our industries, Madam Speaker. That's what it is we were supposed to be talking about today. But instead, they bring in the motion on the infrastructure bank. And not only do they bring in a motion on infrastructure bank, and given the position of the Conservative Party on the infrastructure bank, I hope, whether it's the Bloc or the New Democrats, will bring in an opposition day motion to seek clarification. I'd like to see the leader of the Conservative Party backtrack on the issue of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. If he really believes in building a stronger or a healthier Canada, this reckless policy of getting rid of the Canada Infrastructure Bank is the wrong way to go, Madam Speaker. The member or the leader of the Conservative Party needs to understand that investments in infrastructure matters. I could go all through, the 46 projects that are there, even though the Conservatives want to spread information that is not accurate. Read what they said in their speeches, just in the introduction here. They tried to give the false impression that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is doing nothing, that there really are no jobs because none of the jobs are actually completed. What about the hundreds, or if not even potentially thousands of jobs, both directly and indirectly, that have already in place, people working today, because there's 46 projects that are underway? Some will get completed sooner than others, Madam Speaker. Some of them will have a huge difference in the environment. I'm thinking about the community of Brampton. I remember, a number of months ago, when I was looking at the Canada Infrastructure Bank, they were talking about with investments to electrify their public transit buses, Madam Speaker. I don't know exactly where they are today, but I can assure you that they are making progress. And it's not the only public transit in Canada that has accessed the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I would think that that is a good thing, Madam Speaker. Now, I understand, some members in the Conservative Party don't necessarily care about electrification of vehicles, and I suspect that also includes buses. Rather, they try to play up myths as if it's something that at the end of the day is going to see cars blowing up or catching on fire because we have too many electric vehicles and it's such a small percentage overall in the population. It's that whole tin hat syndrome that they tend to have, Madam Speaker. It is something.
Order, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Yes, Madam Speaker. I would say that, again, according to the new rules, we're not supposed to be calling names. And in terms of it being a specific individual, there were two members opposite that raised the specific issue of cars on fire made by myself. And I did correct the record and let them know that the Bureau of Transportation Statistics says there's 3.5% of those vehicles.
On the point of debate as well. And so, again, I want to remind members to please be careful on the wording that they are using in the House. Again, if it's best to try to make sure that the debate is respectful. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Point of order. Sorry, I have a point of order. The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think if you listen back, I don't believe that the Liberal member referred to the member wearing a tin hat. He talked about a tin hat, that these were tin hat scenarios. So if the member identified herself as wearing a tin hat, that's her issue, but he did not refer to her wearing a tin hat, but it may look proper.
Again, I just want to remind members, so there is I think all sides of the House uses certain words to describe situations or to describe parties. We have to be very careful not to describe individuals. And so I will go back and listen to exactly what was mentioned, and we'll come back if need be. Another point of order, the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
And so, again, according to the new guidelines, the member from Timmins James Bay cannot do indirectly what he cannot do directly. So, I think that's what he attempted to do.
And again, when I was making that comment, I was making it for everyone. So I just, again, want to remind members to please be respectful with their comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, I was here when the members opposite spoke, and the member from Calgary, he makes reference and he says, well, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is nothing more, is what he is saying, and it's not a direct quote, but he used the word boondoggle, he used the word slush fund, and he amplified those words, Madam Speaker. And he was very, very clear in terms of what it is that he believes. And the reason why I raise that, Madam Speaker, is because I really don't believe. I do not believe that the Conservative caucus as a whole is aware of the many investments that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has made. I think what they're aware of is the political spin that is coming from their leader's office in the back room, Madam Speaker. And the political spin is, well, there's a couple of words that you need to use in this particular debate. One is the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a bad thing and the Conservative Party will get rid of it. And the Canada Infrastructure Bank hasn't completed anything. So you get Conservative members standing up, believing what it is that they have been told. And there's a problem with that. And you don't have to believe me directly. Do a simple Google search of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you will get a very good sense in terms of the valuable role. So anyone that's going to be following the debate today on the Canada Infrastructure Bank, make sure you even consider doing a little bit of research on your own. And you will find that the Conservative Party is completely and absolutely out of touch on this issue. It makes no sense whatsoever, Madam Speaker. One of my colleagues provided me a sheet here just to give you a bit of a sense, Madam Speaker. There's actually 11 projects dealing with public transit today. I made reference to one of them being in Brampton, and it is a significant project. Here's an interesting, there's 8 projects dealing with clean power. Now think about this one here. The Darlington Small Modular Reactor. Now, Darlington is a wonderful community in the province of Ontario. $970 million. Once built, the small modular reactor will reduce carbon emissions by an average of 740 kilotons annually between 2029 and 2050. The 300 megawatt SMR will provide enough electricity to power 300,000 homes, Madam Speaker. 300,000 homes. I don't know exactly how many homes Winnipeg has, but I would suggest to you that would be close to half, Madam Speaker. 300,000 homes being powered. And the Conservative Party says the Canada Infrastructure Bank is doing nothing. This is just one project, Madam Speaker, in a community. I look to my colleagues and even members of the New Democratic Party and the Bloc Party. Before you position yourself in any way that would show any sort of support to the Conservative Party on this issue, please look at the projects that are there. This is an environmentally, I would believe, sound project that's going to be the benefit of 300,000 homes. And in the long term, Madam Speaker, this is the types of projects. Look at I made reference to the buses on Brampton because I remember seeing the video on it, and I was really impressed, Madam Speaker. There's no way my time's run out already, Madam Speaker, or getting close. The point is, Madam Speaker, is it doesn't take very much to get a very good sense of exactly what it is that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is investing in. The bottom line, Madam Speaker, is we're talking about close to $27 billion, most of which is not the Government of Canada's money. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Before I go to questions and comments, it is my duty to inform the House that for the purposes and under the provisions of Section 50 of the Parliament Act, the following members have been appointed members of the Board of Internal Economy, namely the Honourable Karina Gould in place of the Honourable Mark Holland as member of the King's Privy Council,
and the Honourable Member Stephen McKinnon in place of Mr. Dominique Leblanc as a member of the King's Privy Council, and Mr. Mark Garrett
Monsieur Mark Gerritsen en remplacement
in place of the Honourable Stephen McKinnon as a representative of the Government Caucus.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member Central Okanagan Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm just finally glad that that speech is over. This particular member, Madam Speaker, made reference to a Homer Simpson award. Well, Homer Simpson, Madam Speaker, will at least admit that he has made a mistake by saying dough. This particular prime minister and that member that supports him go rake walking almost every day, whether it be on foreign policy or on the economy. They smack into a rake, and they, instead of saying dough and trying to say, what should we be doing differently, they just continue on. Look, Madam Speaker, the Infrastructure Bank was created in 2017. They got rid of a very useful P3 Crown Corporation. It took $35 billion away from municipalities. Dough. Will he finally admit that the only thing that this infrastructure bank has given is bonuses to their executives consecutively? There's been zero transparency. And finally, the Transportation Committee has said in a majority opinion that it should be abolished. Will this member admit that, to a dough moment and give himself a Homer Simpson award?
Again, you know, we're going back and forth, and I've had individuals come up to the chair as well, so I just want to say if we could be respectful during the debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the member, you know, did he actually listen to anything that I said in regards to what it is the Canada Infrastructure Bank has done? And yeah, I did make a mistake. I could have actually modernized. I was saying 46 projects. I understand it's actually 48 projects. I said a total of, I think it was 27 billion. It's actually 28 billion, Madam Speaker. You know, it's beyond me. I do not understand why it is that members of the Conservative Party that have already spoken on this issue are being so reckless. It makes no sense at all. Look for yourselves. Look on Google. Look at what it is the Infrastructure Bank is reporting as projects that are well underway, that are going to be completed. I do not understand why the Conservative Party is so much against infrastructure investment, Madam Speaker. It makes no sense.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I really enjoy the member for Winnipeg North's humour, and I really enjoyed his presentation on Homer Simpson Awards, because I know an absolute winner, the winner of all winners of the Homer Simpson Award, and this is an award that should be shared. When one infrastructure project, $30 billion were put into a pipeline. Earlier, the member said, well, the Conservatives are irresponsible. They're going to take away $10 billion of investment in infrastructure. We collectively put $30 billion into a pipeline. If that's not a Homer Simpson prize, I don't know what is, but I'd like to ask my colleague if he agrees that Quebec would be better served if the infrastructure funds were transferred directly to Quebec so that they could manage them themselves. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the biggest challenge that I have with my friends in the bloc is it doesn't necessarily mean what program is out there. They prefer to see the Canadian government as an ATM machine and just hand over money to the provinces. And there is no sense of accountability. I think that's the kind of sense that I get. So it doesn't matter. Like even when we were talking about housing, it's hand over the money. When we talk about health care, it's hand over the money. When we talk about infrastructure now, it's hand over the money. I believe that Ottawa does have a strong national leadership role to play on a wide spectrum of issues. That is the expectations that Canadians have, and I believe that as a government we are delivering on those expectations in the best way we can.
The honourable member had the opportunity to ask a question. If he has other questions or comments, he should wait for the right moment.
Questions and comments? Young member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There's $133 billion of investments that went to the United States last year from Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and commitment on the environment. Our workers and our environment is getting a 1-2 punch, one from the Liberals who've made lots of promises on these investment tax credits. They promised them over a year ago. They are nowhere to be seen. Investment dollars are moving south. The other punch is coming from conservative ideology. Danielle Smith, who chased out $33 billion in clean tech, turned Alberta into a clean tech wasteland. We have the Conservatives blocking every effort to get the sustainable jobs legislation. And we have their MPs from the 401 corridor ridiculing the $7 billion investment by Volkswagen, the $7 billion by Stellantis. We need to send certainty to international markets that we're ready to be there and play a role. And yet, without the tax credits and without an environment to make it happen, that investment money is going elsewhere.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the member raises a concern that I think at least a good number of members, I can assure you in terms of the Liberal caucus as a whole, that we want to be able to ensure that we are getting those good quality middle class jobs in renewable energies. And there's been a very strong statement over the last number of months that Canada is prepared to lead the world when it comes to electric batteries. And that's one of the reasons why we saw the huge investment in regards to electric battery productions. And it's more than just the Volkswagen facility. That Volkswagen facility, Madam Speaker, I believe it's going to be something like the footprint will be like 200 football fields. It will be the largest manufacturing plant, from what I understand, in the country, Madam Speaker. We take it very serious in terms of how it is that we can capture those renewable jobs well into the future, or those green jobs, Madam Speaker, as we often like to talk. And the United States is aggressively also looking for those jobs. So we have to be in a position to push hard.
The honourable member Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by saying I agree with the member for Winnipeg North insofar as his comments with respect to needing to go faster and further on the climate crisis. And it's not just he and I'll quote the UN Secretary General, his words, "Our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. The global climate fight will be won or lost in this crucial decade on our watch." Now, to the substance of the report, he'll note that in the report, this is a $35 billion infrastructure bank, and several witnesses called out their concerns with the lack of efficiency in getting funds out. I'll cite Heather Whiteside, associate professor from the University of Waterloo. Her words, CIB hasn't done much. At the time, over half of the projects announced were in the MOU stage still. Dylan Penner from the Council of Canadians told the committee that he was concerned with the CIB's delays as well with respect to action on the climate crisis. What would the member for Winnipeg North have to say in response to these nonpartisan witnesses' concerns?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the question, and again, I would really encourage members to take a look in terms of the programs and the progress that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has actually made, and the types of programs that are there. So, for example, when it comes to green infrastructure, they have 17 projects that have been approved and are well underway in terms of development. When you talk about clean power, there are 8 projects that are there, and that's just through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. There are numerous programs over and above that the government has initiated, both through budgetary and legislative means, to encourage the development of green industries, including the Atlantic Accord, working with provinces to make a difference. Something in which, again, the Conservatives are wanting to filibuster, but that's here and there for right now. At the end of the day, we continue to move forward, both from a legislative point of view and organizations that are arm's length, like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, in expectation that we are moving towards what we had committed to, that net zero.
Question, the honourable from Edmonton Manning.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. The honourable member from Winnipeg North was telling us if he was listening to his speech, he was basically talking about how nice that structure, that structure of the bank, the bureaucratic structure of the investment bank, and giving us a bunch of poetries about how beautiful the bank is, without any evidence, and how productive those results of these investments that he spoke about, and how much Canada has benefited from such thing was supposed to be a bank to deliver investment and results rather than to be a structure that's really doing nothing.
Parliamentary Secretary, a brief answer.
The simplest way of putting it, Madam Speaker, is to look at it from the point of view of the 28 type billion, or just under $28 billion of total that's going to be going through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. One new factor in both private and the Canada Infrastructure or public dollars coming from Ottawa, Madam Speaker. That means it's almost 2 to 1. You almost have $1 coming from Ottawa versus $2 coming from other sources. Those other sources are not going to be investing if they did not believe that the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the 48 projects that are out there were not worth their while in investing. I think that speaks more than any member of the Conservative Party can in terms of its criticism.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, today we're debating the Transport Committee's report on the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I'm surprised that we're debating this today because I have to say that the report from the Committee on the Infrastructure Bank dates to May 2022, and now we're in fall 2023, so it's been quite a while since the report was tabled. We certainly could have debated it long before this. That having been said, I think there's a good point that needs to be mentioned here, which is, and to explain maybe why the Conservatives want to debate this, is that there are recommendations in the report, and often there are many recommendations in the report. When it comes to the CIB, there was one single recommendation, only, and I'll mention that the member from the Liberal Party who preceded me, the member for Winnipeg North, who regularly rises to speak in this House, doesn't seem to have read the committee's report before he made his speech, because he said the Conservatives are against, and he's right about that, and he said the other parties should really listen to me and think before they take a stand on this. But maybe he didn't know that the other parties had, in fact, already taken a position on this, because, there is a committee report where the parties took a position, and if there are recommendations in the report, it's because all the parties had a position, and there is a report, a largely majority report, in which the majority of members of the committee agreed on one recommendation, which is that the Canada Infrastructure Bank should be abolished, Madam Speaker. And, how did we come to a majority on this? This is done in camera. The voting is secret. But how did we come to a majority if the government's against? Well, it's probably because all the other parties voted in favor of that recommendation. So when the report came out, it was agreed that it was necessary to abolish the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So to explain a little bit what the Canada Infrastructure Bank is and why it exists from a Quebec point of view. Well, in terms of infrastructure in Canada, how much infrastructure is owned by the cities, how much is owned by the provinces, and how much is owned by the federal government? So what's the role of the federal government when it comes to infrastructure? Well, 98% of infrastructure doesn't belong to the federal government. There's just 2% of infrastructure in Canada that's under the responsibility of the federal government. So what's the role of the federal government to say, we're going to get involved in infrastructure? There's a problem here. There's a clear issue here. So putting $35 billion into this, well, it's not up to the federal government to decide how we're going to manage our infrastructure. If there's just 2% of infrastructure in the country that they're responsible for, well, it seems like that responsibility is misplaced. It's cities or the government of Quebec that is in charge of infrastructure in Quebec, and so they should be getting the money. It doesn't make any sense to support a Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is just being used by the federal government to interfere in areas of provincial jurisdiction. But when it comes to the CIB, it's worth noting that pretty much every witness who appeared was very critical of the CIB. Maybe the Liberal member wasn't aware of that, but I really didn't hear from many witnesses who were in favor of the Infrastructure Bank. And maybe the honourable member knows this because he's been in politics for a few years now, but in the Liberal platform from 2015, the Canada Infrastructure Bank was there. So he could say, listen, we put in place something that was in our platform. He could say that. But I'd like to go a little bit further on that, because in their election platform in 2015, the Infrastructure Bank that was mentioned and the Infrastructure Bank that were put in place were a little bit different. In the 2015 Liberal platform, you can see on page 16 that the Infrastructure Bank should be used to allow municipalities to have a lower interest rate for loans used to put in place infrastructure and housing. So, look, they were talking about the housing crisis in 2015. Is there housing in the Infrastructure Bank's mandate as it is today? No. And they don't offer low-interest loans to municipalities. The vocation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank has changed over time. After the election of this Liberal government in 2015, the government decided to put in place something which they called an advisory board on economic growth in Canada. And that board was presided by none other than Dominic Barton, a great friend of the Prime Minister. He was close to Trudeau, and he also appointed a number of other friends, and I'll come back to that later. And so with this advisory board on economic growth, Mr. Barton had other jobs as well. He was president of McKinsey, and that's maybe not, well, let's say that it's an important point to mention. And so this advisory board on economic growth looked at the question of the Infrastructure Bank, and one of their main recommendations in their first report outlined how they saw the Infrastructure Bank going forward. And again, I'll note that this board was chaired by the CEO of McKinsey, Mr. Barton. But there's another point here, which is that there were a number of people around the table, such as, for example, Michael Sabia, who would have a role to play later on with the Infrastructure Bank, and the Secretariat, because, again, when you have a board, there's also a Secretariat that has to do the real work, take notes, make sure things move forward. Well, it wasn't federal bureaucrats who were working on this, Madam Speaker. No, it was McKinsey. McKinsey, who was hired or who was apparently on a volunteer basis, providing people who were working on the Infrastructure Bank. They were taking notes. They were providing briefing notes. So they were the Secretariat for this project.
A quote on what we were told about the McKinsey Secretariat. They said, McKinsey acted like a volunteer secretariat. Their suggestions and ideas and concepts came from the board, but as you know, an organization like an advisory committee needs a secretariat. McKinsey filled this role, and they significantly contributed to our deliberations and our reports. So volunteers, that's what we have. But when Mr. Barton appeared before committee, I asked him, were they truly volunteers? Were they volunteers for the government, or were they also volunteers for McKinsey? Well, they were paid. McKinsey paid them, but not by the federal government. But the report was a report for the federal government. So it was pro bono work, but they were still funded by McKinsey. Is that really pro bono? Is that really volunteering? Was there no interests of McKinsey in this matter? Could that perhaps have had an impact on the committee's decisions that would advise the government? Could McKinsey perhaps have an influence on this? That's what I conclude from this. When we have a look at the first report for the creation of an infrastructure bank, it no longer proposes what the Liberals offered in 2015. The recommendation was public money being used for private projects. They said, bring us infrastructure projects and then we will fund them. They want these funds to be used for our infrastructure and private projects, which seems to have changed from the initial Liberal idea from 2015. It's interesting to see that there was a change of opinion. There was a growth council that studied the matter, staffed heavily by McKinsey, that seemed to be piloting discussions. Perhaps someone may have gotten some contracts because of this. Is it their domain of expertise, Madam Speaker? I asked the question, but I think that many people know what the answer is. The only difference I saw between the Economic Growth Council's opinion and the Government of Canada's plan was $5 billion. An infrastructure bank at $40 billion was the recommendation, and the government went forward with $35 billion. The rest is a copy-paste. The implementation of proposals was rather rapid. Not even a month after it was tabled, federal government documents were already ready to implement an infrastructure bank. That would be almost a copy-paste of what was recommended by this council. Global Affairs Canada confirmed this during the Long-Term Investment Summit. All that to say, was it in the public interest? I don't know. What I do know, however, Madam Speaker, is that the infrastructure bank is going poorly. It was funded in 2017, but in 2021 they didn't know where they were going. They couldn't find staff. The board was a mess. No one spoke French. It was like a madhouse, Madam Speaker. No one knew what to do. They were just given $35 billion and they didn't know what to do with it. So they called someone as an emergency. Dominic Barton. And he worked with Michael Sabia. And Michael Sabia was recruited to become the head of the infrastructure bank. What was rather interesting, Madam Speaker, is that when I asked the question to Mr. Sabia, how did things happen? Did you send your CV? Were you headhunted? How were you recruited? What he said is that he got a call from Bill Morneau. And that shocked me. We're being told that infrastructure bank isn't political in nature, but the Minister for Finance called this person individually saying, hey, I've got a job for you. Do you want to join us? Worse than that, it's not even his department of the time. The infrastructure bank isn't under the Department of Finance. It's under the Department of Infrastructure. So it's the minister of an unrelated department that calls someone. That's great for open democracy and transparent democracy. You'll understand why my position is one tainted with sarcasm. Once again, Mr. Sabia, head of the Infrastructure Bank in 2020, said, well, things are not going too well. He came as a firefighter to put out the fire of the Infrastructure Bank. One of the first things he did, Madam Speaker, was to give a consulting contract without tendering to who? McKinsey, Madam Speaker. What a coincidence, Madam Speaker. McKinsey once again. McKinsey's volunteer work seems to have paid its dividends. A $1.4 billion contract to McKinsey, well, 1.4 million rather, not billion, is not something to sniff at. Why was McKinsey chosen?
The decision taken at the time was to use some of the people from McKinsey who had been involved in the initial thinking around the infrastructure bank to draw on their accumulated knowledge. Okay. Donc c'est dire.
So, they knew the infrastructure bank well, And so the government said, well, we're going to grant them the contract, it'll go more quickly. So as soon as they came up with the infrastructure bank structure, yes, of course, they were experts in the field because they're the ones who told the government what to do in the first place. And now they're being given a contract, but instead of being volunteers this time, well, quasi-volunteers, now they're being paid. So they can say the same thing again, but for money this time. The bank didn't exist originally. So this is all rather fascinating, Madam Speaker. The point to which volunteering has paid dividends. It isn't pure altruistic volunteer work. Quite the contrary, it can pay private dividends. It doesn't seem to be what the government seems to think, however. So, Madam Speaker, I also asked a question to Michael Sabia when he appeared before the committee. I asked him, the bank is in dire straits, but before you became head of the infrastructure bank, you were at the Caisse des Dépôts du Québec. And so, the infrastructure bank invested in the REM, which was part of the Quebec, the Quebec position he had in the past. So the infrastructure bank invested in the REM. But before the infrastructure bank existed, the federal government already invested in the REM. $1.28 billion. All of a sudden, this transferred into a loan. There's a difference between a subsidy and a loan. This was a government loan for the Montreal Light Rail Transit Line, or REM. The Quebec lost out because now they have to pay interest on the loan rather than receiving a subsidy that would help them and help the project. So I asked Mr. Sabia how that decision was made, how the process happened. Mr. Sabia said it was a decision made by the government, and the government informed us of the decision of the change. So it's apparently not political. The infrastructure bank made the decision, but it was the federal government that made the announcement. There were no projects in the infrastructure bank's roster that they said, well, you know what, we'll take a project that already exists, and then we'll take money from the infrastructure bank so that we can say that the infrastructure bank is doing its job. That shows us how things are managed. The infrastructure bank isn't really useful, isn't really germane. Projects that already exist, with funding that already exists, is now being apparently piloted by the infrastructure bank, Madam Speaker. These billions and billions that should have been raining all over Canada, we were being sold dreams of showers of money. But at the end of the day, these investments never actually came to be. These new investments never came to be. Most projects invested into by the infrastructure bank are public projects, where our municipalities, our provinces, and our federal governments have already invested in. We want these projects to come to be because they're important to us, but the federal government was just scratching its head saying, well, you know, we're going to try and find a way to make it go through the infrastructure bank, but it's not political. It's not political, it's arm's length. But at the end of the day, we know full well that this infrastructure bank is very political. And it's not political for nothing. After having been head of the Infrastructure Bank of Canada, after his quick séjour in the Infrastructure Bank, from April 2020 to December 2020, well, after that, magically, he became Deputy Minister for Finance 2020 to 2023. Well, that's odd. Deputy Minister is... Well, of course, I'm sure that he applied. There were many candidates. There was an open and transparent process for this position. So, understand, Madam Speaker, at one point it becomes flagrant. No one believes in the transparency of it all. Unfortunately, the Infrastructure Bank of Canada is like a hot potato that the Liberals are trying to justify, saying, yes, well, it's very useful. It's useful for us. But what cities have told us at committee, and what they keep telling us, is that the money that they need for infrastructure, housing infrastructure, water infrastructure, all the infrastructures they need in municipalities, it's not necessary. It shouldn't go through federal infrastructure plans that have very difficult, almost Kafkaesque conditions behind them. Then they need to see if the program is compatible with Quebec or other provinces, and they hire people to study, whether they should hire people to study. No, Municipalities want direct money that can build direct infrastructure, and there's a program that works. There's apparently the perfect technique would be to give money to Quebec, and then Quebec would decide where to invest it in its infrastructure. But there's another method that we could live with, saying there is a gas tax fund. It exists very well. Well, there are a couple of fine-tunings to be done, but it works generally fairly well. A part of that money could be used in infrastructure, and then cities can build the infrastructure that they need, not infrastructure that the federal government decides that they need. That works well. Why shouldn't we strengthen this kind of project, which gives more flexibility to provinces? No. The federal government wants Ottawa-made and Ottawa-beneficial projects that will, at the end of the day, make us fall off a cliff. They don't work, Madam Speaker. That's what I wanted to deplore today, and I hope that the member across the way has understood why all parties apart from his will vote against.
Questions and comments? Honorable Secrétaire Parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The Bloc is voting against for a totally different reason. They're a party, ultimately, that wants to see Canada broken up. They're a party that doesn't want to see the federal government playing a role more than just handing over money. That's the Bloc's position and why it is ultimately they're opposing it. But needless to say, under the Canada Infrastructure Bank, there's a number of projects in the province of Quebec. I just did a quick look on the Canada Infrastructure Bank just to find out one of the projects, and one of the projects that I like is 4,000 zero-emission school buses. I suspect that there's a very good chance that that project in good part is made possible because of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. All communities in Canada will directly or indirectly benefit by the investments of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The Bloc don't like the Canada Infrastructure Bank because it goes against who they are as a political entity. Would the member not agree?
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the member across the way for his question because it allows me to answer an argument that he raised earlier in answer to a question from one of my colleagues. He said that for the Bloc, the federal government is an ATM. We want money without accountability, apparently. What I would like to say is that it's an interesting image. It's a cute allegory. And I do recognize that he drew up a nice portrait. But the reality is that who fills the ATM? It's we, taxpayers, that fill the ATM. It's our tax that fill the ATM in the first place. So we would like to control what we do with the money that we put in the ATM in the first place, than allowing the federal government to dictate their priorities that are not ours.
Questions and comments? Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For me, it's clear. The Infrastructure Bank is a Liberal team that grants projects to Liberals, that invites their friends to apply and get contracts. I think that it's not in Canadians' interest. What does the member have to say about that? The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I would say in answer to that statement in question is that the Liberals are in a bad position because this Infrastructure Bank started so poorly and there's no escape from that. When we see Liberals granting contracts to Liberal friends and then who try to create programs for Liberal friends, as we saw with We Charity, as we saw with this Mackenzie contract issue, no one has any trust in this at the end of the day. The best thing to do would be to start from scratch once again.
Edmonton Strathcona.
Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his intervention today. And I agree with him on many of these things. You know, my background is in international development, and I will say that going to communities, going to provinces and telling them what they need is not good practice. The municipalities should have the ability to have more control over the infrastructure projects. We also, as the NDP, brought forward a supplementary report or a supplementary response to the committee response that we're debating today. And one of the things that was brought up, one of our colleagues, I can't remember her riding name, but one of our colleagues has brought forward a bill, it's Bill C-245, an act to amend Canada's Infrastructure Bank, and it looks at fixing some of the problems that this member has actually talked about, like prioritizing projects in Indigenous and Northern communities, altering the structure of the board of the bank, and removing the privatization aspects. Would he be supportive of that sort of legislation?
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher-les-Patriotes-Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We understand the NDP. They always try to find ways to save the government and help out the government and bail out the government. Oh, we have to pity the Liberals. They have to remain in power. But the reality of the matter is that the Infrastructure Bank is an institution that failed from the very beginning. They're now trying to piece it back together. It's not up to the federal government to butt its nose into infrastructure projects. The federal government should transfer the money to those who need it, instead of trying to hinder and decide what should be done. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his excellent speech. I think that he clearly showed, with proof, with evidence, with facts, that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a logical organisation at best. Political interference promotes Liberal friends and Liberal values. But I would like to ask another question. The colleague for Winnipeg North mentioned that the federal government is an expert in infrastructure. Just one example for that, because it's quite the opposite. A bridge that was privatized in the 90s, there have been negotiations between Ottawa and Quebec over the past 15 years to try and update it and renovate it. The Liberal government, Madam Speaker, said in 2015 that it was a priority, a promise. 8 years later, still no solution. Another example, Madam Speaker, 25 ports in eastern Quebec. In 2017, the same government wanted to sell them for $1. They say they are experts in infrastructure, but they are ready to abandon these ports for $1 because they are so incapable in administering them and maintaining them. I'd like to hear what my colleague has to say on that matter. The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher-les-Patriotes-Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I like what my colleague had to say, my colleague for Rimouski-Témiscouata-les-Basques, with regards to the federal government that can't handle its own existing assets. When you go around Quebec, go to airports, go to other infrastructure projects, they keep saying the federal government has abandoned us. They don't invest in us. In my riding, in our village, we have an infrastructure issue. The issue is, apparently they're experts, but they abandon the infrastructures. And our towns and our villages are saying, well, that's the federal government, and that's the issue. The Honourable Member. Madam Speaker. Montmagny, Lillers, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. I hadn't realised myself. But, Madam Speaker, I find it unbelievable when I hear Bloquiste and Liberal colleagues talking about a government's ATM. The Government of Canada is not an ATM, Madam Speaker. Not only for infrastructure, but for all services. It's not a free-for-all bank. We're talking about taxpayer dollars. Up to now, the Liberal government has not been able to balance a single budget. And now they're trying to teach us lessons through the infrastructure bank, which is a huge boondoggle that funds Liberal projects. The worst thing is, my colleague supported it at committee. So the Bloc Québécois not only supports the infrastructure bank, they also support the carbon tax, which means that Quebecers will pay even more on gas, for example. Madam Speaker, my question is as follows. Why does the Bloc Québécois support the Liberals so often?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not sure what to answer. I'm not sure my colleague was during my speech, because I talked about the image put forward by my colleague. I didn't claim to be in agreement with those things, and I did not claim to agree with the infrastructure bank. Perhaps he's inventing his own reality. But if he were really listening, I think he would better understand why his question missed the mark. We have time for a brief question.
Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I am listening very closely, and there is a difference in opinions from the Conservative, but they're united. You have a Conservative bloc, a coalition to get rid of the Canada Investment or Infrastructure Bank. I believe, and this is more of a comment, Madam Speaker, I think that is a sad thing for all Canadians in all regions, because the Canada Infrastructure Bank has many fine things that it is doing. It's having a very positive impact in all regions of the country, and it's sad to see the coalition of the Bloc and the Conservatives to try to get rid of it.
We have time for a brief answer. The Honourable Member. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think the Conservatives and the Liberals need to talk, because the Conservatives accuse us of supporting Liberals. The Liberals accuse us of supporting the Conservatives. The reality is that the Bloc supports Quebec, and maybe that's what bothers them.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll be splitting my time with the member from Churchill, Kiwatanuk-Aski. More and more often, Canadians are experiencing the extreme and harmful effects of wildfires, droughts, and flooding due to climate change. This year was the longest and worst wildfire and drought season on record, claiming lives, causing loss of homes and crops, and challenging Canada's fresh water security. It has never been more critical for Canada to proactively invest in climate-ready infrastructure to protect Canadians and to make communities more resilient, physically and socially. Our communities need to be connected, supported, and have the ability to support growing populations that can withstand climate change. Projects need to be completed, and the federal government needs to act with more urgency. Members of the New Democrats understand the urgency and have been proposing changes to the Infrastructure Bank for many years, so that it will actually work for Canadians. My colleague from Churchill, Kiwatanuk-Aski, brought forward a private member's bill that spoke to the importance of this, proposing public ownership of the CIB in the fight against climate change. Her bill spoke to the importance of a focus on rural and northern communities that are underfunded and left without critical infrastructure. Basic infrastructure like water and roads. The Conservatives and the Liberals refused that common sense solution. In the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, my colleague from Skeena-Bulkley Valley also addressed the concerns of the CIB, not efficiently delivering projects that will serve the public good. He spoke of the issues arising from private sector involvement in delivering public infrastructure, the inadequate sensitivity to the needs of communities in funding decisions, and issues with costs and transparency. With an ample $35 billion in federal government funding, the CIB should have, by now, been able to narrow Canada's infrastructure gap, delivering projects that would have created jobs and supported communities for the long term. But after years of the bank, the gap in the most basic of infrastructure needs, water and housing, is growing. This is a failure, Madam Speaker. When this study was done, PBO's analysis of the bank's project selection process showed that of the 420 project proposals received, there were only 13 publicly committed to. Alarmingly, it was found that the bank had rejected or was no longer considering 82% of the submitted projects. Most were screened out because somehow it was decided they were in the wrong sector or deemed not of sufficient size. As the large number of proposals showed, communities clearly have infrastructure needs that require federal support. However, the bank's rigid fixation with massive projects and private sector investment means it rejects most proposals. Communities that need the funding the most are being denied. The result is that critical projects have not been completed and Canadians are left without vital infrastructure to support their needs as the devastating impacts of extreme climate events increase. The costs associated with the climate crisis will continue to rise unless we take a different approach. I suggest the adage of an ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure. This should be a consideration in how projects are selected. As a country, we need to be prepared for the next devastating flood, drought, or wildfire. In BC, the province I call home, the rivers and lakes are the cornerstone of the local economy. Forests, fish, food crops, quality of life, and cultural memories. Yet watersheds in BC and across Canada face increasing pressures as extreme climate events threaten their stability. When a watershed is healthy and maintained, it can minimize climate change risk, support local wildlife populations, clean drinking water, and increase disaster resiliency. First Nations, local governments, and communities are working every day on the front lines of the climate crisis with limited resources to keep watersheds healthy and secure. Indigenous and Western science confirms that healthy watersheds protect against climate disasters like drought, wildfire, and floods. Yet the CIB is not supporting them on this natural infrastructure. Healthy watersheds serve as natural defenses against the climate risk. Wetlands act as natural sponges, purifying water. Stream banks filters polluted runoff, and they provide shelter for salmon. Mature forests retain water and they release it when needed most. This is low-cost, climate-resilient, natural infrastructure that the government is ignoring. We need to bold federal leadership and investment in natural infrastructure to address the climate crisis in BC and across Canada. The watershed sector in BC is a major employer and economic driver, generating over 47,000 indirect and direct jobs and contributing $5 billion to the GDP. The recent investment of $100 million by the BC NDP government in the co-developed BC Watershed Security Fund with the First Nations Water Caucus is an important start, but the federal government needs to be at the table with a federal investment. We are seeing the successes that can happen when government properly invests in their communities, when projects are completed, funding is transparent, and communities can plan for changes, addressing immediate needs for their communities to grow and flourish. I close by saying the NDP supports the findings and recommendations of the majority of this report concurred in today, which details in length the failure of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. As I have said, if the government stays on the same path and continues with this bank, it is time to change its mandate to make the CIB a public bank to serve the public good. Right now, they could invest in the BC Watershed Security Fund, give Indigenous, provincial, and municipal governments the resources they need for better planning and decision-making, and invest in natural infrastructure to fix the water and housing deficit in this country.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think it's important to recognize that the federal government has all sorts of other infrastructure joint projects, both with provinces and municipalities. That the Canada Infrastructure Bank is just another tool that is out there, a very important tool. BC is also benefited by it. I made reference when I talked about Quebec in terms of electrified buses. The same thing is happening in BC, where I think it's not one, but maybe two approvals where we are seeing more electric buses. The NDP talk about the energy and a cleaner environment and so forth. Many of the infrastructure jobs that are being created are greener jobs. They're leading to more environmentally sound projects. This is Canada Infrastructure Bank has demonstrated very clearly that it can make a difference, a positive difference for Canada's environment. Can the member explain why it is the NDP would want to see it abolished? Because that's what the Conservatives are proposing, along with the support of the Separatists.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think this just demonstrates how the Liberal government does not understand the urgency of the infrastructure deficit across this country. Talking about one or two approvals, those programs that the federal government is talking about are always oversubscribed. It's impossible for small communities, northern and rural communities, to get the infrastructure they need in those lottery-based infrastructure programs. I had meetings just this week with municipalities out of Saskatchewan and out of British Columbia that don't know if they're going to get funded for those projects. They have to wait years to get funding from this government. What the NDP is talking about is regular, steady investment in the infrastructure gap. There's no reason why the infrastructure bank can't do it, except for the fact that the government does not want to spend one penny of their own money. They're open to giving a loan, but they will not invest one penny of money to get this infrastructure gap addressed.
Questions and comments? The honourable member Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciated my colleagues' comments on this matter. And I will note that the amount of money she speaks about that the government's spending with their checkbook diplomacy here, putting money in the pockets of their friends all the time, far exceeds any of the amount that any of the government's programs on the NDP's supply and commitment to keep this government in power, like the dental plan. There's way more money going into this slush funds and the other slush funds this government's put together than in their supply agreement. So I would ask her, would she consider withdrawing her support from her party's commitment to continue supporting this government because of the boondoggles that she sees in this bill?
The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Madam Speaker, there's no bigger slush fund than what the oil and gas industry has taken from Canadians over the decades. I can talk specifically to Coquitlam, which hosted the Kinder Morgan pipeline since the 1950s, who was paying basically the most marginal amount of taxes to the city of Coquitlam. They did not invest in one hospital, one school, one community center, one road, one bridge. And I can tell this member that in the last 8 years, since the Kinder Morgan sale and their expansion of the TMX, they started offering sponsorships around the city in relationship to small businesses and business events. It's a joke, Madam Speaker. There are billions of dollars of federal subsidies going to oil and gas that could come right in to these projects around infrastructure.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I agree with what my colleague just said. There's a lot of money, too much money, going to the oil industry. My colleague earlier was saying that the Conservatives are completely disconnected from the fight against climate change, which is true. But last year, the IMF concluded that Canada in 2022 had invested directly or indirectly $50 billion into the oil and gas industry. That's not including the pipeline that cost us $33 billion, Trans Mountain. We could use that money to fight climate change, to build housing. There's so much infrastructure that we could do, electrifying cities. We could better use that money than how it's being used right now. A brief answer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I agree with my colleague. It's a disgrace that the Liberal governments and the Conservative governments before that subsidized oil and gas. We lost lives this year in wildfires. Young people under 20 years old lost fighting fires because of the burning of fossil fuels in this country. It's time for change, and the Liberal government needs to get with the program and modernize their thinking.
Reprise de débat. L'honorable député de Churchill, Kiwanamuk Aski. Député doit mettre son micro dessus.
The member has to turn her microphone on. I don't know if it's not connected or if she just needs to click the button.
Non, ça fonctionne pas.
No, it's not working.
Débrancher et rebrancher.
Can you disconnect and reconnect, please?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, merci.
Oui, OK. Super. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. It is an honor to be rising in this House to speak to an important report put forward by the Transport Committee, taking on the Canada Infrastructure Bank, an institution, a crown corporation that the Liberals have touted as a real model for years, and unfortunately have very little to show for it. I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague from Skeena-Bulkley Valley, as well as other MPs from other parties who've been very clear that the Canada Infrastructure Bank, that over a year ago was sitting on $25 billion, had very little to show for the work that it was supposed to be doing. I also want to share in the record, as colleagues of mine have said, that I am proud of the work that we've done to put forward a private members bill, C245, to transform the Canada Infrastructure Bank for the better for Canadians. In essence, our private members bill, Bill C245, aimed to make three major changes. One, to remove the private for-profit model. Second, to prioritize Indigenous and Northern communities that we know have the greatest infrastructure gap in the country, particularly around climate-related projects. And third, to shift the governance model requiring Indigenous representation on the governance board. I'm very disappointed that both Liberal and Conservative MPs voted against my private members bill. To the Liberals, I want to acknowledge the support of Northern MPs from the Liberal side, the MP from the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, and others who abstained, recognizing the desperate need for infrastructure investments in our communities, in Northern Indigenous communities facing the climate crisis. But to all the Liberals that voted against 2C45, Bill C245, I would say that it's not wrong to be able to admit to your mistakes. This is the legacy of Bill Morneau, who's long gone from this House. The model of the infrastructure bank as it exists right now is not making a difference for Canadians, is not bettering the lives of Canadians across our country. And to Conservatives, who we know with great fury oppose the Canada Infrastructure Bank, it was telling that they refused to support C245 that sought to transform...
Yeah, the honourable member on a point of order.
Oui, il y a un problème avec l'interprétation, on n'entend pas l'interprète.
Nous attendrons quelques secondes pour améliorer la situation.
We're looking into the situation.
Order. I'd ask the honourable member for Churchill-Kiwatinuk ask you to say a few words, and hopefully that will ameliorate the situation. And if not, we may have to proceed to a different member. But I'd ask the member to say a few words and a few phrases, and hopefully interpretation will restart.
Okay, j'espère que, or I guess in English, I hope that you can hear me okay, and that the sound is coming through okay. I am looking forward to continuing my speech, if that's possible. It's okay.
Order, and interpretation does seem to be functioning now, so I would ask the member to restart where she left off. The honourable member.
Great, thank you very much. I will also say that I'm very disappointed that Conservatives did not support my bill C245 that sought to transform the infrastructure bank in such a way that it could make a difference for the lives of Canadians, that it could make a difference when it comes to the major infrastructure needs in our communities. It's not a bad thing to have a Crown corporation whose commitment is to build desperately needed infrastructure in our country, particularly as we face the climate crisis. We know that our infrastructure needs are significant on various fronts, but we know that we are particularly deficient when it comes to climate resilient infrastructure and ensuring that our communities have the kind of infrastructure they need to be able to face the climate crisis. And I will say that and I do want to acknowledge that the Bloc did support our bill on second reading, and I'm thankful for that support as well as that of Green MPs. But the reality is that in ditching Bill C245, Canada missed an opportunity to transform a Crown corporation, an infrastructure bank, in such a way that could meet the needs of our communities. I will say that my bill was rooted in the experience of communities like the ones I represent, communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, communities that are facing record wildfires, record flooding, communities such as the First Nations on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, who do not have all-weather road access and have to rely on ice roads for shorter and shorter periods of time to be able to access medical services, get out to be able to shop more affordably, and to be able to bring the materials in that they need to build the homes that they desperately require and other necessary infrastructure. I heard time and time again from First Nations and Northern leaders, and as a Northerner myself, it is clear to me that the infrastructure gap in regions like ours is only getting worse. In talking about C245, I heard stories from First Nations that were refused funding to upgrade a community hall that was in desperate need of fixing because they couldn't show Canada's Infrastructure Bank how it was profitable. Or Northern community that was trying to switch off from diesel fuel and were told to apply for solar panel funding in the middle of winter. Serious concerns from Indigenous leaders that Indigenous services may help out once things are really and truly broken, but not a moment before. Prior to my constituency, prior to Bill C-245 coming to the House at second reading, I acknowledged at the time that communities in my riding were facing immense challenges as communities were becoming isolated with the melting of the ice roads. Some of the projects that we talked about needing investing were the need for an all-weather road on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, connecting a dozen First Nations that right now are becoming increasingly isolated as a result of the impacts of the climate crisis. We also talked about the transfer from diesel reliance to more sustainable forms of energy. 4 of the communities I represent in the far north of northern Manitoba still depend on diesel fuel. We know that many communities in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories are in the same boat. This is unnecessary given our abilities to invest in sustainable energy, and that requires government involvement. The Canada Infrastructure Bank would be well placed to be involved in this kind of work. I would say that as the climate crisis becomes more and more serious, it is clear that our infrastructure is not up to snuff. It is clear that our communities desperately need a partner in the federal government to invest in the infrastructure that we need. Currently, we know that Indigenous Services Canada is not meeting the needs by a long shot of Indigenous communities when it comes to infrastructure. The housing crisis, for example, in communities is acute. The need for a critical infrastructure, whether it's health centers, whether it's infrastructure related to water and sewer, whether it's roads in the community or roads, like I said, connecting community to community that currently don't exist. Indigenous Services Canada is not meeting the needs of Indigenous communities. The Canada Infrastructure Bank could play that kind of role. It's not a role that it's playing right now. Now, I want to say since C245, we have noticed that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has paid greater attention to the needs of Northern and even Indigenous communities. I want to acknowledge the work of being done on the airport here in Thompson and the Canada Infrastructure Bank's involvement there. I also want to acknowledge the work of the Keewatin Tribal Council in pushing the visionary Pusiko development and hope that the Infrastructure Bank will be a willing partner in terms of investing in this kind of legacy project. But I'm deeply disappointed that we're still not seeing the kind of significant investment in Northern and Indigenous communities and communities across the country therefore underscoring the work of the Transport Committee. What is the point of an infrastructure bank that isn't making a difference to communities? And on that end, I want to end off by saying that many of us here in Parliament are here because we want to better the lives of our constituents, people across our country and around the world. To that end, I would like to finish off my speech by stating clearly that Canada must call for a ceasefire now in Israel and Gaza. Canada must be a voice for peace and justice. As the representative of UNRWA has said, history will ask us why the world did not have the courage to act decisively and stop this hell on earth. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member, Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member knows, there are many different ways in which government supports infrastructure. I've made reference before, in the last 50-plus years, no government has invested more public dollars in infrastructure, and that also includes the province of Manitoba, where we have agreements with the municipalities and provinces. Now with the new government in the province of Manitoba, I think there is even greater opportunities, and I'm looking to the member to provide her thoughts in regards to, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is an add-on, a very important add-on to the building of Canada's infrastructure. Even Manitoba has benefited through the expansion of rural internet services. My question to her specifically is, will she not acknowledge that is only one aspect of infrastructure? It needs the provinces and municipalities also to step up and say, here are our priorities, and she might want to share that with some of her provincial colleagues in particular.
Member for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong-Aski.
Well, as I said in my speech, current departmental programs, particularly under Indigenous services, are clearly inadequate when it comes to meeting the needs of Indigenous communities on infrastructure. Time and time again, I've raised with Liberal counterparts the need to invest in the all-weather road on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, and they've patently refused to do that. The Liberals talk a good talk when it comes to reconciliation. Part of reconciliation is addressing the housing crisis and the infrastructure gap in Indigenous communities. It's a gap that's only growing, and I certainly hope that the Liberals don't think that what they're currently doing is sufficient. It's not, and what we need to do is transform the infrastructure bank to make the difference that Canadians deserve, Indigenous and Northern communities deserve. And if that's not going to be the case, then we should get rid of it.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for her speech. Now, there were a lot of witnesses that came to committee and had comments about the lack of transparency within the Canada Infrastructure Bank. People didn't know how, where the money was going, how much each project was getting. It was very difficult to get that information. Could the member comment on her experience when she listened to the testimonies at committee?
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong-Aski.
Well, the testimonies from committee were damning when it comes to the track record of the infrastructure bank, and again, the strongly worded recommendation to get rid of the bank is deeply rooted in that testimony. But what we've said is let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Do we need a Crown corporation that has as a focus to partner with communities in building the infrastructure they require? Yes. Do we need it the way it is right now, that seeks to gain profit for private partners, that is not transparent, that is not committed to infrastructure that's resilient in the face of climate change? No. And so I will say that despite some of the cosmetic changes, there's still very serious concerns about the infrastructure bank's existence. And like I said, we certainly put forward a transformative vision for the bank. We hope that it can still be applied, and if not, we should get rid of it.
Questions, comments. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, sorry, and I would like to thank my colleague for her intervention today. She brought forward Bill C-245, and it was a way of fixing the infrastructure bank. Because I think what we've seen time and time again with this government is that they are very good at coming forward with these big projects, these big words, these big announcements, proposals, but like the red dress alert, like announcements on housing, like the core ombudsperson, which I know she knows quite a lot about, the action isn't actually there. The follow-through is not there. Does she believe that this infrastructure bank can be saved if the Liberal government actually stepped up and put some principles in place, principles that were in her legislation that she wrote to fix the infrastructure bank at this time?
I'm a member for Churchill Keep Watanuck Aski with a brief response.
Well, thank you to my colleague and for her kind words. I think we're all here because we have hope that that we can change things for the better, and I hope that the Liberals will see that there is a desperate need to transform the bank. They made some cosmetic changes in the recent budget in terms of focus on Indigenous communities. It's nowhere near enough. We know the climate crisis is only deepening. Our communities' needs for infrastructure and investment are only deepening. The time is now to transform the infrastructure bank.
Reprise du débat, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today on this topic. I have to wonder, however, Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives made a very critical error today in their strategy, because it's interesting to me that the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, actually used the issue of the Canada Infrastructure Bank to filibuster from the legislation that was scheduled to be discussed today, which actually would allow and authorize the Minister of Industry, where he considers that investment could be injurious to national security, and to allow him the ability to review such things. So it's interesting to me, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservatives, who talk tough when it comes to national security, when have an opportunity to actually debate it, have legislation to keep Canadians' national security interests at the forefront of what we do to modernize legislation, what do the Conservatives do? They filibuster and block legislation. I think their strategy today is going to be very telling to Canadians that they don't actually care about national security interests in this country, because if they did...
Order. The Honourable Member for Sarnia and Lambton on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, you know that the new guidelines have been issued and that we're not allowed anymore to make comments that question the courage, honesty, or commitment to their country of other members in this House. And so I think that was where the Liberal member went on that one, if you could correct her.
I thank the Honourable Member. I would just remind the House that we try to use our words in a judicious manner to try not to cause disorder. So I'll give the floor back to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, it seems I've hit a very specific nerve with the Conservative Party. It seems I am alluding to exactly what they are afraid of, which is that they are not serious when it comes to matters of national security. They're reckless when it comes to producing meaningful legislation that would actually keep Canadians safe. But, Mr. Speaker, what I find even more interesting is the fact that they've just allowed Canadians to see very clearly about how not serious they are when it comes to matters of national security. They've chosen a topic which, for me, I have been looking forward to the day for us to discuss our plan for infrastructure versus the Conservatives' reckless history. So the fact that the Conservatives chose to abandon principles of ensuring our national security legislation continues to be modernized. The fact that they chose a topic such as infrastructure tells me that whoever was in charge of this scheme here today did not actually do their homework, and they're about to be quite embarrassed for the next 3 hours or however long this debate continues. So, Mr. Speaker, let's start talking about infrastructure and the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is what the Conservatives felt was going to be a winning issue for them. Let's talk about Conservative math for a second. The Conservatives have talked here today. I've listened to them refer to things as slush funds. Meanwhile, the Conservative infrastructure plan previously included gazebos, fake lakes, and photo ops with fighter jets. But despite that, let's actually talk about Conservative record on building infrastructure. The Conservatives had what they called P3 Canada, which was their Conservative infrastructure program. In 10 years, they had 25 projects, only a total of $1.3 billion invested. What? Let's compare that, Mr. Speaker.
Oh my goodness. The Honourable Member for Sarnia and Lambton on a point of order.
Sure, Mr. Speaker, we all want to make sure that facts are presented in this House. The fund of which the member is speaking of actually did 43,000 projects, and there was $53 billion.
Order. The Honourable Member, that is debate, but on same.
Mr. Speaker.
On a different point of order, the Honourable Member.
This is now the second time in which, at very, very best, the point of order has been marginal, at very, very best. And the member is, I don't know if it's being intentionally done with this particular member, but I believe the interference when a member is speaking is not appropriate, and that is a point of order, Mr.
Order. I thank the Honourable Member. When there is a point of order, one does tend to listen to it. There should be a connection to the standing orders to the precedents of this House. I think we've dealt with the points of order at hand, so I will give the floor back to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't be surprised that the Conservatives are going to try and interrupt my speech continually because the facts matter, and they don't want to be confused by them. They don't want Canadians to actually realize their record on infrastructure is abysmal. So I'm sure they're going to keep interrupting, which actually further proves my point that this strategic goal to block legislation that deals with national security, that they're reckless. They're reckless when it comes to national security. And then they choose a topic where their record is also reckless and abysmal. So of course they're going to keep interrupting because their feelings are going to probably be hurt and they're probably embarrassed. They're probably going back to their House Leaders team going, why did we choose this topic? It was so terrible because the Liberal members, were able to point out our terrible record. Why did we do this today? But Mr. Speaker, I'm going to persist and continue to highlight to Canadians the recklessness of Conservative math. So let's get back to that. 10 years the Conservatives had, and how many projects did P3 Canada work on? 25. 25 projects, $1.3 billion. Let's compare to just under 5 years with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, 48 projects. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, let me go back to that $1.3 billion that the Conservatives invested in 10 years. All taxpayer-funded money, all from Canadians. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, in less than 5 years, 48 projects, $10 billion of investment from the government. But you know what that turned into, Mr. Speaker? A $28 billion investment. We heard at committee that investments like that are transformational. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I want to quote something we heard, or a witness we had at committee, and something she spoke about on her own podcast, the podcast called The Rate Stuff, the infrastructure deficit, the role of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. This was in January 30th, 2023. And who said this, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Lisa Raitt, a former Conservative minister. And what she talked about, she was speaking with, talking about the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and she said, unfortunately, quote, unfortunately, the bank has been the topic of political discussions of the past numbers of years and was not supported by the Conservative Party at various times in the last Parliament and in this Parliament as well. However, you're doing a lot of work, you're getting projects done, and you are, I think, filling a need that is being shown to be necessary in order to get projects going here in Canada. Tell me what's going on in 2023 for the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the projects you're going to be looking at. Mr. Speaker, Conservative former ministers don't even support the Conservatives' position on this because, as most Canadians know, Conservative math just doesn't add up. They're reckless. They spend more taxpayer money to get less projects done in double the amount of time. That's Conservative math for you. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk about some of these projects that members I've heard here today refer to as slush funds. I find that pretty interesting. They've called it only Liberal insiders are getting rich from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I want to speak about a project in Alberta, the Aero Technology Group, $8.1 million investment. This is building broadband in underserviced communities, including 20 Indigenous communities and 4 rural communities. Mr. Speaker, are the Conservatives suggesting that these underserviced Indigenous communities are rich Liberal insiders benefiting from this bank? Or is it that they just can't wrap their head around how to actually build infrastructure that matter for Canadians, matter for Indigenous communities, matter for rural communities, and ensuring that they are connected so that they have the ability to stay connected with loved ones, to create economic prosperity in these communities? Mr. Speaker, the fact that the Conservatives would insult Indigenous and rural communities in Alberta by calling this somehow a slush fund is deplorable. Mr. Speaker, let's also talk about in Saskatoon, $27.3 million to the English River First Nation for wastewater treatment. This will be the first Indigenous-owned wastewater treatment plant. Is that more Liberal insiders getting rich, or is this real investments for Indigenous communities so that they have economic development in their communities, so that they can ensure clean water, the development of wastewater treatment plants allow for economic development, allow for growth in Saskatoon? Are the Conservatives suggesting that that the jobs created from this infrastructure investment, that those families should be sent pink slips because Conservatives want to cancel this project? There are shovels in the ground. There are jobs in communities happening right now. Conservatives would see those employees fired. They would see those shovels being put away. And Mr. Speaker, it's completely reckless to destroy local economies, to destroy local families from being able to provide for themselves because of Conservative ideology, because they don't believe that they should help build up Canada. They only want to tear it down. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the Cheveton.
Order. The honourable member for Haldimand Norfolk on a point of order.
It is to impugn the character of your colleagues. We've already established that that is something that the new rules set out that we should not be doing. And so to say that Conservatives want to tear Canada down, I would request that the member withdraw that. It is not. Order.
Order. I would just remind all members to be judicious in our use of language to avoid causing disorder in the House. I'll give the floor back to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the fact that Conservatives want to fire people in these communities, I think, is tearing down communities and tearing them apart and not building up economies for Indigenous populations, for rural Canada. I want to also talk about the Cheveton Rail project. This would be the first Indigenous-owned railway in Canada. And it's, quote, a lifeline for northern communities. This would connect northeast Quebec with Western Labrador. This railway will deliver food, fuel, building supplies, vehicles, and medication. And it's under construction, Mr. Speaker. You know what the Conservatives would do? Rip that infrastructure out, cut off those communities. They would cut off the ability for food to be transported between northeastern Quebec and Labrador. They would limit communities from being able to access medication. Why? Because they want to block national security legislation here today? Mr. Speaker, the level of recklessness provided by the Conservatives on this topic, like I said, I'm sure they'll be sending messages to their House Leaders team going, guys, why did we do this today? Why did we give the Liberals the opportunity to highlight just how little we want to invest in these communities who need it most? Why did we give the Liberals the opportunity to highlight our reckless record, to show that they want to cancel projects delivering food and medication to communities? I can't believe that the Conservatives would open this door today to give us the opportunity to highlight to communities just how much they don't want to invest in communities, how they're willing to cut off communities from even things like food and medication. Mr. Speaker, it is shocking to me to see this.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order, the honourable member for South Okanagan, or Similkameen Nicola.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know this parliamentary secretary is so full of criticism of us because she can't point to any real results for her own government. But I haven't heard her even talk about what we're here to do, which is encourage on infrastructure. Order. Thank the member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola. I think that is going into debate. There is broad relevance, or broad latitude on relevance, and I would just give the floor back to the honourable member, the parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I feel for you, but I can imagine right now that behind the scenes here there are Conservative staffers texting and furiously saying, interrupt her speech, ruin those clips, don't let her keep going, even though that's precisely why they don't even interrupt with actual procedural issues, and instead it's just debate. It actually, I laugh, Mr. Speaker, because it's laughable at the fact that the Conservatives would actually block the ability for national security legislation to be for legislation to be modernized, taking into account national security issues, and that they would choose a topic that their record is so terrible on. So I feel sorry for the staffers over on the Conservative side today, furiously typing like that cat gif saying, please interrupt her, Canadians are going to be made aware of their terrible record on infrastructure. And I can't help but take immense joy at being able to talk about this topic today, because we're able to talk about very real projects like the ones I've just mentioned. But I'm going to talk about another project, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservatives, if they had their way, would see cancelled. And this is another Alberta project, one that was for a rail system to go from the Calgary airport to the Banff National Park. Mr. Speaker, what would this do? This would build enormous tourism opportunities for the community. How would the members opposite, how would Conservative members representing some of these ridings go to their communities and say, that infrastructure that we're going to build that's going to help support tourism in your community, that's going to help create jobs, that's going to help create economic development in such a crucial area in our community? Well, they'd like to cancel it, Mr. Speaker. Why? Who knows? They don't really have a plan. So I think it's just, again, whatever day they come up with, thank you, yes, reckless policies, that they don't think about the very real impacts. Mr. Speaker, I've also heard comments from members opposite saying there's no transparency. They don't know where the money is going for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I have a quick tip. There is an entire website on the Canada Infrastructure Bank that details these projects. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? They even have photos. So if members opposite don't want to read the text, they have photos of the construction in progress. They have photos of the jobs being created to see the very real impacts that this program is having across the country. Mr. Speaker, in addition to this, there was numerous testimony, including by a former Conservative member who's now the Mayor of Brampton, Patrick Brown, who talked about the investment of buses in his community. In fact, it was a $400 million investment for 450 zero-emission buses. And Mr. Speaker, the Mayor of Brampton said that this would not be possible without the Canada Infrastructure Bank. This was a game changer, and this is going to help the residents of Brampton and the city reach their 80% GHG reduction emission goals by 2050, I believe, is their timeline. Mr. Speaker, I want to know why Conservatives don't support municipalities when they're trying to address the challenges of climate change, when they want to deliver for their communities on things like reliable, clean transit, when municipalities want to create clean air for their residents. Why do Conservatives oppose that? And Mr. Speaker, I know I'm running out of time, which will be to great relief for the Conservatives and their staffers who are frantically trying to find points of order so that Canadians don't have to hear the facts about how reckless they are, how unserious they are when it comes to national security, and how their record on infrastructure is actually kind of embarrassing that they would choose this topic given their history. But Mr. Speaker, the last point that I want to talk about is the overall policies around the Canada Infrastructure Bank, why it exists. These projects are some of the hardest projects to get shovels in the ground for. This is not to replace traditional infrastructure programming. There is a role for both. These projects require enormous investment, sometimes expertise that smaller rural communities may not have access to, and they may be some of the hardest to actually get in the ground. So there is a role for both. But Mr. Speaker, if the Canada Infrastructure Bank was cancelled like the Conservatives are suggesting, that would mean broadband ripped out of the ground, jobs and individuals fired. They laugh. They laugh at the idea of jobs, people being fired because of their ideology when it comes to infrastructure. And the ideology